At 5:23 a.m. on June 19, 1944, Aviation Machinist's mate. First class. Robert Hendricks crouched in the gun turret of a TBF Avenger torpedo bomber on the deck of USS Enterprise, watching the pre-dawn darkness over the Philippine Sea, and knowing the torpedo strapped beneath their aircraft had been tampered with. He'd done it himself, 3 hours earlier, alone in the armory. His pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Walsh, sat 12 feet ahead in the cockpit, running through his checklist. Walsh didn't know about the modification. Nobody did. If the torpedo malfunctioned, Hendricks would face court-martial. If it worked, he might save their lives. The deck beneath them vibrated as Enterprise turned into the wind. Around them, 23 other Avengers prepared for launch. Hendricks knew the statistics. On average, 19 of those 24 aircraft wouldn't return. Torpedo bombers had the highest casualty rate of any aircraft in the Pacific. Men called them flying coffins. But Hendricks had figured something out, something the Navy's Ordnance experts had missed, something so simple it seemed impossible they hadn't seen it. The catapult officer raised his flag. Walsh pushed the throttle forward. In 90 seconds, they'd be airborne. In 2 hours, they'd either be dead or they'd change everything. Robert Hendricks was 24 years old, a mechanic's son from Duluth, Minnesota, who'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Before the war, he'd spent 2 years working at his father's garage, rebuilding engines, fixing transmissions, solving problems that manufacturers said couldn't be fixed. His father had taught him one principle: if something doesn't work, figure out why. Don't wait for someone else. That principle had kept Hendricks alive for 18 months in the Pacific. He'd been assigned to Torpedo Squadron, 10 aboard Enterprise in January 1943. His job was simple: maintain the TBF Avenger's gun turret, assist with ordnance loading, and try not to die when his pilot flew into anti-aircraft fire at 200 feet above the ocean. The Navy called him a radio man gunner, but really he was there to manually arm torpedoes after launch and shoot a .50 caliber machine gun at fighters trying to kill them. Walsh had been his pilot for 7 months. Boston Irish, 26 years old. Former college baseball player who'd washed out of fighter training and gotten stuck in torpedo bombers. He was a decent pilot, careful, followed procedures. That's probably why he was still alive. Together, they'd flown 23 combat missions. 0 kills. 17 times, their torpedo had either malfunctioned or missed. 4 times, they'd been forced to jettison the torpedo without dropping because the arming mechanism had failed. Twice, they'd watched their torpedo hit a Japanese ship and not explode. Every mission, Hendricks watched pilots die. Not from enemy fire, from their own equipment. The Mark 13 torpedo was designed to drop from 200 feet at 200 knots, hit the water, dive to 10 feet depth, then run straight toward the target. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, it was a death sentence. The depth settings were wrong. The arming mechanisms jammed. The guidance systems failed. Pilots died approaching targets. Pilots died from their own torpedoes exploding on impact. Pilots died because their torpedoes missed, and they had to make second runs through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The Navy knew about the problems. Engineers had submitted reports. Test data showed consistent failures. But fixing the Mark 13 meant admitting it was defective, admitting contracts were awarded improperly, admitting thousands of men had died because of bad engineering. So the Navy declared the torpedo within specifications and kept sending men out to die. The first man from Hendricks' squadron to die from torpedo failure was Aviation Machinist's mate, second. Class David Kowalski, 22 years old. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, April 7, 1943. Rabaul Harbor, Kowalski's pilot dropped his torpedo at perfect parameters. 190 feet, 205 knots, 800 yards from a Japanese destroyer. The torpedo hit the water, dove, and immediately porpoised back to the surface. It broached 3 times, leaving a wake any gunner could track. The destroyer turned toward it. Anti-aircraft batteries locked onto Kowalski's bomber. They were too low and too slow to evade. Hendricks had watched from 200 yards away. He'd seen the 25mm rounds walking up the water toward Kowalski's Avenger. He'd seen them impact the engine cowling. The bomber had simply dropped into the ocean. No fire, no explosion. Just gone. The pilot, Kowalski, and their bombardier. 3 men dead because a torpedo couldn't maintain depth. The second death was aviation radio man 3rd Class James Chen, 21 years old, San Francisco, California. May 14, 1943. Eastern Solomons. Chen's torpedo armed prematurely. The arming vanes spun in the airstream during approach, activating the detonator before launch. When their pilot dropped, the torpedo exploded immediately. The blast wave caught their tail section. Control surfaces shredded. They pancaked into the ocean at 180 knots. Hendricks' squadron circled overhead for 20 minutes. No survivors surfaced. After Chen died, Hendricks started keeping a notebook. He recorded every torpedo failure, every malfunction, every death. He interviewed surviving air crews. He examined recovered torpedoes. He spent hours in the armory disassembling Mark 13s, studying the mechanisms. He found the problem. The depth settings were calibrated for cold North Atlantic water. Pacific water was warmer, less dense. Torpedoes ran 3 feet deeper than designed. They passed harmlessly under shallow draft destroyers. They hit deeper than optimal against cruisers. The Navy's own specifications were killing American pilots. Hendricks wrote a report, submitted it through proper channels. It disappeared. He wrote another. Same result. His commanding officer told him to focus on his assigned duties, so Hendricks watched more men die. And he started planning how to fix the problem himself. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo used a simple hydrostatic depth mechanism. Water pressure compressed a diaphragm, which actuated a valve, which controlled the diving planes. Set it to 10 feet, and theoretically it ran at 10 feet. But the mechanism was calibrated at 55-degree water temperature. Pacific water averaged 78 degrees. The density difference meant the hydrostatic pressure was 18% lower than specification. Every torpedo ran 2.8 feet deeper than set. That fraction of error meant death. Japanese destroyers had 11-foot drafts. American torpedoes set to 10 feet ran at 13 feet. They passed completely underneath. Pilots made perfect runs, dropped perfect torpedoes, scored perfect hits, and watched their torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. Then they died during their mandatory second approach. Hendricks had explained this in his reports. He'd shown the math. He'd demonstrated it with captured Japanese depth gauges that confirmed Pacific water density. The response from Naval Ordnance Bureau had been 2 sentences. Mark 13. Torpedo performance is within acceptable parameters. Field modifications are not authorized. Translation: shut up and die quietly. The bureaucratic logic was simple. Admitting the depth calibration was wrong meant admitting the entire Mark 13 production run was defective. 16,000 torpedoes, 120 million in contracts, congressional investigations, careers destroyed. It was easier to let pilots die than to admit the mistake. So the Navy sent out memos. Pilot error in approach altitude. Insufficient training in release parameters. Target maneuvers during attack run. Never. Our torpedoes don't work. Squadron commanders knew the truth. They wrote their own reports. They requested immediate engineering review. Those reports got filed in Washington. Nothing changed. The torpedoes kept failing. The pilots kept dying. By June 1944, Torpedo Squadron 10 had lost 37 aircraft in 14 months. That was 111 men. Dead. Because the Navy's torpedoes ran too deep. June 11, 1944. Philippine Sea, Aviation Machinist's mate. First Class Leonard Hayes died because he followed procedures exactly. Hayes was from Sacramento, California. 23 years old, mechanic like Hendricks. They'd gone through training together. Hayes was meticulous. By the book. He checked every setting twice. He never cut corners. His pilot, Lieutenant Franklin Pierce, got a perfect approach on a Japanese heavy cruiser. 185 feet altitude, 198 knots, 750 yards range. Hayes manually armed the torpedo as trained. Pierce dropped at optimal parameters. The torpedo hit the water cleanly, dove, and ran straight. Perfect attack. The torpedo passed 6 feet beneath the cruiser's keel. No detonation, no damage. Pierce had to make a second run. The cruiser's anti-aircraft guns were ready. They hit the Avenger in the port wing root. Fuel tank rupture. The bomber exploded before it could climb away. Hendricks had been monitoring the radio. He'd heard Hayes confirm torpedo armed. He'd heard Pierce called dropping. He'd heard the silence afterward. No mayday, no bailout call, just silence. Enterprise recovered Pierce's wingman. The pilot confirmed the attack. Perfect approach. Perfect drop. Torpedo ran true. Ran deep. Missed low. Hayes and Pierce and their bombardier died for nothing. That night, Hendricks sat in the armory for 4 hours. He had a Mark 13 on the workbench. He had technical manuals. He had his notebook full of failure data. And he had an idea so simple he couldn't believe it took 18 months to think of it. If Pacific water made torpedoes run 2.8 feet deep, just reset the depth setting 2.8 feet shallow. Set them to 7 feet, they'd run at 10. Set them to 8 feet, they'd run at 11. Simple. Obvious. The adjustment mechanism was right there. 3 turns of a calibration screw, but that was unauthorized field modification. The Mark 13 manual explicitly forbade adjusting depth settings without Bureau of Ordnance authorization. Doing so violated federal regulations. Court-martial offense. Possible prison time. The Navy took weapons tampering seriously. Hendricks sat there, holding the calibration tool, knowing 3 turns of a screw would save lives, and knowing if he turned it and the torpedo malfunctioned, he'd be blamed for everything. He put the tool down. Walked back to his bunk. Tried to sleep? June 12th. Another mission. Another pilot died. Lieutenant Raymond Douglas, 27 years old, Detroit, Michigan. Same story. Perfect approach. Torpedo ran deep. Missed. Second run. Anti-aircraft fire. No survivors. June 13th. Aviation radioman 2nd Class George Miller, 24 years old, Atlanta, Georgia. Torpedo armed prematurely again. Exploded on release. Blew the tail off their Avenger. They cartwheeled into the ocean. June 14th. June 15th. June 16th. 3 more aircraft. 9 more men. Same problems. Same preventable deaths. Same bureaucratic refusal to fix anything. By June 17th, Torpedo Squadron 10 had 14 aircraft operational. They'd started the deployment with 24. 10 aircraft lost. 30 men dead. And the Navy was ordering them into the biggest carrier battle of the war. June 18th, 1944. 2100 hours. Enterprise mess deck. Walsh sat across from Hendricks, pushing cold coffee around a cup. Neither of them were sleeping much. The scuttlebutt said Japanese carriers were 300 miles northwest. Every pilot knew what that meant. Maximum range strike. Torpedo bombers going in first. Heavy losses expected, Bob, Walsh said quietly. I need to ask you something. Hendricks waited. These torpedoes. The depth settings. You've been studying them. Walsh wasn't making eye contact. Is there anything we can do? What do you mean? I mean 19 of us are taking off tomorrow. Maybe 8 of us come back. I'd like to be one of the 8. Walsh finally looked up. You're the smartest wrench I know. If there's anything at all. Hendricks had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it, because saying yes meant court-martial. Saying no meant watching Walsh die. There's something, Hendricks said slowly, but it's unauthorized. If anyone finds out, I'm done. You're probably done too. Will it work? I think so. 90% sure, Walsh leaned forward. Bob, I've got a girl back in Boston. We're supposed to get married when I rotate home. I'd really like to make it home. That's when Hendricks made the decision. Not because of regulations, not because of procedures, because Walsh had a girl in Boston, because Hayes had been from Sacramento, because 30 men from his squadron were dead, and the Navy wouldn't fix the problem. Okay, Hendricks said, but you can't tell anyone. Not the squadron commander, not your bombardier, nobody. What are you going to do? Adjust our torpedo's depth setting. 3 feet shallow. It'll compensate for Pacific water temperature. Should run at proper depth instead of too deep. Walsh nodded slowly. When? Tonight. Oro 200. After the deck watch rotates. I'll need 8 minutes. What if it doesn't work? Hendricks met his eyes. Then we die. Same as if I don't do it. But at least we'll die trying something new. At Aero 147 hours, Hendricks left his bunk. He carried his toolkit and a flashlight. The hangar deck was quiet. Most of the squadron was sleeping, trying to get rest before the morning mission. The deck watch was forward, drinking coffee. Hendricks found their Avenger, Bureau number 25782. He'd maintained this aircraft for 7 months. He knew every rivet. He crawled beneath the fuselage where the torpedo nestled in its cradle. His hands were shaking. He'd modified engines. He'd repaired hydraulics. He'd never tampered with ordnance. The Navy's regulations about weapons modification were absolute. This wasn't bending rules. This was breaking them. But Hayes was dead. Douglas was dead. Miller was dead. 30 men were dead. And tomorrow Walsh would be dead unless Hendricks did something. He opened the access panel on the Mark 13's depth mechanism. The calibration screw was exactly where the manual said it was. 3 complete turns counterclockwise would adjust the setting from 10 feet to 7 feet. In warm Pacific water, that meant actual running depth of 10 feet. Perfect. His flashlight beam caught the screw head. Standard flathead. His screwdriver fit perfectly. He started turning. Click, click, click. Each turn felt like another step toward prison. Or toward saving lives. He wasn't sure which. 1 complete rotation. The adjustment was smooth. The mechanism looked undamaged. No evidence of tampering unless someone specifically checked calibration. 2nd rotation. Sweat dripped off his nose. The hangar deck was 85 degrees. Or maybe he was just terrified. 3rd rotation. Done. He closed the access panel. Checked for tool marks. Nothing visible. Unless someone specifically tested the depth setting, they'd never know. He crawled out from under the Avenger. Checked his watch. 8 minutes. Perfect. The deck watch was still forward. Nobody had seen him. Walking back to his bunk felt like walking to execution. If the torpedo malfunctioned, if it ran shallow and surfaced, if it armed incorrectly, Walsh would crash and Hendricks would be responsible. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Possibly prison, but if it worked, if it ran true, if it maintained proper depth, they might actually hit something. They might actually survive. Hendricks lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. In 4 hours, Walsh would take off. In 6 hours, they'd either be dead or they'd prove the Navy's ordnance experts wrong. There was no middle ground, no safe outcome, just success or death. He didn't sleep at all. At 05:23 hours on June 19, 1944, Walsh pushed the throttle forward. Enterprise's catapult flung their Avenger into pre-dawn darkness. Hendricks felt the familiar gut punch of acceleration. 3 seconds of crushing force. Then they were airborne. 14 other Avengers formed up behind them. The target was 280 miles northwest. Japanese carrier strike force. Intelligence said 3 carriers, maybe 4. Every torpedo bomber in the task force was launching. This was the mission everyone had been expecting. The big one, the carrier battle that would decide the Philippine Sea. Walsh kept them low, 150 feet above the water. Torpedo bombers always approached low, made them harder to spot, made them easier to kill once spotted. Hendricks sat in his turret watching the sun come up behind them. Beautiful morning, clear sky, calm water, perfect day to die. The Mark 13 hung beneath their aircraft. Modified, unauthorized, secret. Hendricks hadn't told Walsh what time he'd done the modification. Walsh hadn't asked. They both knew it was done. That was enough. At 06:47 hours, the radio crackled. Bandits, 035, 20 miles. Walsh's voice came through the intercom. Here we go, Bob. Hendricks charged his .50 caliber, checked the ammunition feed, scanned the sky. Nothing yet, but they were approaching. Japanese carriers meant Japanese fighters. Zeros. Fast, maneuverable, deadly. The first 0 appeared at 06:51 hours. Then 3 more. Then a dozen. They came down from 15,000 feet. Diving attacks. The Avengers scattered. No fighter escort. Torpedo bombers were expendable. They'd sent them out alone. Walsh threw their Avenger into hard evasive turns. Hendricks tracked a Zero coming in from port. Fired. Missed. The Zero ripped past, 20mm cannons hammering. Rounds punched through their wing. No critical damage. They kept flying. 2 minutes to carriers, Walsh called. Everybody hold together. But they weren't holding together. Hendricks counted 9 Avengers still flying. They'd lost 5 already. Zeros were everywhere. The sky was full of tracers and smoke and burning aircraft. At 06:53 hours, Hendricks saw them. Japanese carriers. 3 of them. Massive flat tops. Flight decks crowded with aircraft. They were launching. Zeros taking off. The carriers were maneuvering, turning, building speed. Anti-aircraft batteries opening fire. Black puffs of flak filled the sky. The Avengers went lower. 100 feet now. Wave top height. Hendricks felt every bump, every wind gust. They were too low. One mistake, and they'd hit water. Walsh picked his target. The nearest carrier. Big one. Probably Shokaku or Zuikaku. The carrier's stern was toward them. Perfect angle. 200 yards and closing fast. Arming torpedo, Hendricks called. He reached forward, pulled the arming lever, felt it engage. The torpedo was live, 1,000 yards. Anti-aircraft fire was insane. 25mm guns, 40mm guns, machine guns, everything the carrier had. Tracers crossed the water. Other Avengers were going down. Hendricks saw one explode. Another hit the water and disintegrated. 100 yards. Walsh was committed. No turning back. They were too low and too slow. They had to drop or crash 600 yards. Hendricks could see Japanese sailors on the carrier deck, could see the anti-aircraft gunners traversing their weapons, tracking them, firing. Rounds hit their engine cowling. Oil pressure dropped. Temperature spiked. They were hit but still flying. Dropping. Walsh called. The Avenger lurched upward as the torpedo released. 2,000 pounds gone. Walsh banked hard left. Violent turn. Hendricks lost sight of the carrier. Torpedo away, he called. Running straight, then they waited. 10 seconds. 15. The torpedo ran at 33 knots. 600 yards took 18 seconds. 18 seconds to find out if Hendricks' modification worked or if they'd just wasted their lives. The explosion was enormous. Orange fireball. Black smoke. Debris fountain. The carrier's hull shuddered. Hendricks saw the impact point. Waterline. Midship. Exactly where a torpedo should hit. We got her. Walsh shouted. Direct hit! Bob, we actually hit. Hendricks couldn't believe it. They'd hit. The torpedo had run true. Proper depth. Perfect. The modification worked, but there was no time to celebrate. 2 Zeros were on them. Walsh threw the Avenger into another turn. Hendricks tracked the first Zero. Fired. Short burst. The Zero rolled away. Their engine was failing. Oil streaming back. Temperature redlined. They had maybe 2 minutes of power left. Walsh pointed them toward friendly ships. 60 miles away. They'd never make it. We're going in the water, Walsh said. His voice was calm, resigned. But then Hendricks saw something. Another Avenger, making its attack run. Same carrier they'd just hit. The carrier was listing now. Slowing. Fire visible on the flight deck. The second Avenger dropped. Its torpedo hit the water. Ran straight. Disappeared under the carrier's hull. Nothing happened. No explosion. No impact. The torpedo ran too deep. Missed, just like always. The Avenger tried to climb away. Anti-aircraft fire caught it. The bomber disintegrated. 3 more men dead. God damn it, Hendricks said. The other aircraft had used a standard torpedo. Unmodified. It ran deep and missed. If Hendricks had modified their torpedo too, they might have lived. Walsh fought their dying engine toward the task force. They were losing altitude. 50 feet, 40 feet. The engine seized. Propeller stopped. They glided. Brace for ditching, Walsh called. They hit the water at 90 knots. The impact was crushing. Hendricks slammed into his gun mount. Blood in his mouth. Broken rib. Maybe 2. The Avenger settled. Water rushed in. They got out. 3 of them. Walsh, Hendricks, their bombardier. Life raft inflated. They climbed in. Watched their Avengers sink. 2 minutes. Bow first. Gone. Around them, the battle continued. More Avengers attacked. More missed. More died. Zeros circled like sharks. The carrier they'd hit was burning but still moving. Not dead. Damaged. Walsh looked at Hendricks. Your modification worked. Perfect hit. Yeah. Hendricks watched another Avenger go down. Should have modified more torpedoes. They floated for 3 hours. A destroyer picked them up at 10:35 hours. Back aboard Enterprise by 1400 hours. Squadron commander wanted to debrief immediately. Walsh reported their attack. Confirmed hit. Confirmed torpedo ran true. Didn't mention the modification. The squadron commander looked puzzled. You got a hit? Torpedo actually worked? Yes, sir, Walsh said. Perfect run. 10 feet depth. Dead center. That's the first confirmed hit this squadron's had in 4 months. The commander made notes. We'll put you in for an air medal. Good work. Walsh and Hendricks left the debriefing. Walked to the armory. Sat down on ammunition crates. Said nothing for 5 minutes. Finally, Walsh spoke. We're going back up tomorrow. I know, Hendricks said. I want the same modification. That's not possible. We lost our aircraft. Then modify the next one. Walsh looked at him directly. Bob, we hit. First hit in 4 months. We proved it works. I'm not flying with a standard torpedo ever again. Hendricks thought about it. They'd proven the modification worked. 1 hit, 1 damaged carrier. But 1 hit wasn't data. Could be luck. Could be coincidence. The Navy would say it was luck. I'll do it, Hendricks said. But I'm documenting everything this time. Torpedo serial number, exact calibration settings, water temperature, everything. If they court-martial me, at least I'll have proof. That night, Hendricks modified another Mark 13. Same procedure. 3 turns counterclockwise. 7-foot depth setting. 8 minutes of work. But this time, another aircraft mechanic saw him. Aviation machinist's mate, 2nd Class Frank Norton. Norton walked over. Looked at what Hendricks was doing. That's unauthorized, Norton said. Yeah, Hendricks agreed. It is. You'll get court-martialed. Probably. Norton was quiet. Then, we lost 6 aircraft today. Hayes died last week. If that modification actually works, it works. We got a confirmed hit. Norton looked at the Avenger he was supposed to maintain. His pilot's aircraft. Show me how. Hendricks spent the next hour teaching Norton the modification procedure. Depth, mechanism, location. Calibration, screw adjustment. How to make it invisible. By midnight, Norton had modified his pilot's torpedo. By 0300 hours, 3 more mechanics had joined them. By 0500 hours, they'd modified 8 torpedoes, 8 out of 14 operational aircraft. Over half the squadron. If this worked, it would change everything. If it failed, all 5 mechanics would face court-martial. They'd find out in 4 hours, June 20th, 1944, 0742 hours. Walsh took off again. This time, 12 Avengers launched. They'd lost 2 overnight to mechanical failures. 10 had modified torpedoes. 2 had standard ordnance. Hendricks had briefed Walsh. Walsh quietly told the other pilots with modifications. Not officially. Just, hey, our torpedo hit yesterday. Might want to ask your mechanic to check your depth settings. The pilots understood. They didn't ask details. They didn't file reports. They just knew some aircraft had torpedoes that worked. The target was the same Japanese carrier force. But now there were 4 carriers. Reinforcements had arrived overnight. Intelligence said 1 carrier was damaged. Hendricks' carrier. Shokaku. She was listing. Slowed, but still operational. The attack came at 09:09 hours. 14 Avengers. Same approach. Low altitude. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. Zeros everywhere. The Japanese were ready this time. Walsh went for Shokaku again. Finish what they'd started. The carrier was turning. making evasive maneuvers despite the damage. She wasn't easy prey, but Walsh's approach was perfect. 200 feet, 205 knots, 800 yards. Hendricks armed the torpedo. Walsh dropped. The torpedo hit the water. Dove. Ran straight. Impact. Port side. Forward magazine. The explosion was bigger than yesterday's. Much bigger. Secondary explosions. Shokaku's bow lifted out of the water. The carrier buckled. Started sinking immediately. "She's going down," Walsh called. "She's actually going down." Around them, other Avengers were attacking. The ones with modified torpedoes were hitting. Hendricks watched 3 more explosions. 3 more hits. The Japanese carrier force was in chaos. One Avenger hit the carrier Taiho. Port side hit. The carrier staggered, kept moving but trailing oil. Damage visible. Another Avenger hit a destroyer. Broke it in half. The destroyer sank in 90 seconds. The 2 Avengers with unmodified torpedoes missed. Both ran deep. Both pilots made second runs. Both got shot down. Walsh saw another carrier, Hiyo, undamaged, launching aircraft. He turned toward her. "One more. We've got 1 torpedo. Let's make it count." But their fuel was critical. They'd been airborne 2.5 hours. Maybe 30 minutes of fuel left. Not enough for another attack and return. "Negative fuel," Hendricks called. "We won't make it back." "Don't care," Walsh said. "There's a carrier. We've got a torpedo. We're taking the shot." Walsh set up his approach. Hiyo was maneuvering hard. Destroyers throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire. This was suicide. They'd never survived the approach, but Walsh committed. Full power. Straight in. No evasion. 200 yards in closing. Anti-aircraft fire everywhere. Rounds hitting their wings, their tail, their fuselage. The Avenger was getting shredded. 100 yards. Their port wing was on fire. Engine smoking. Hydraulics failing. They were flying a dying airplane into concentrated fire. 600 yards. Walsh was screaming now. Pure rage. "Drop, drop, drop!" Hendricks armed. Walsh dropped. The torpedo fell. Hit the water. Ran straight. The hit was perfect. Waterline. Starboard side. Amidships. Hiyo's hull buckled. Fire erupted. The carrier started listing immediately. Walsh tried to turn away. The controls didn't respond. Hydraulics gone. They were locked in, heading straight toward the carrier. "Bail out," Walsh shouted. "Bail out now." Hendricks popped his turret. Climbed out. Wind blast nearly tore him off the aircraft. He jumped, free fall, pulled his chute. Parachute deployed. He was floating down toward the ocean between American torpedo bombers and a burning Japanese carrier. He watched Walsh fight the controls. Watched the Avenger stagger. The port wing failed. Broke off. The bomber rolled. Inverted. Fell. Hit the water nose first. Walsh never got out. Hendricks hit the water. Shrugged out of his parachute. Inflated his life vest. Floated. Around him, Japanese and American ships were fighting. Hiyo was burning. Listing. Sinking. Shokaku was already gone. Bow pointed at the sky. Stern underwater. She went down as Hendricks watched. 2 carriers. Sunk. In 48 hours. Walsh had killed 2 carriers. Hendricks floated in the Pacific Ocean. Alone. Watching the battle. His pilot was dead. But they'd sunk 2 carriers. 2. And other pilots with modified torpedoes were still attacking. Still hitting. A destroyer picked him up 4 hours later. Not American. Japanese. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. Didn't matter. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd fixed the problem, June 20th, 1944. 14:30 hours. USS Enterprise. 4 Avengers returned from the strike. 4 out of 12. But those 4 pilots came back with something Enterprise hadn't seen in months. Confirmed kills. Multiple confirmed kills. Pilots were reporting hits. Actual hits. Torpedoes running true. Carriers sinking. The squadron intelligence officer couldn't believe the reports. "You're saying 4 torpedoes hit? 4 out of 12 dropped?" "6 hits," one pilot corrected. 6 torpedoes hit targets. We sank Shokaku. We hit Taiho. We sank Hiyo. We sank 2 destroyers. We damaged a cruiser. 6 hits out of 10 drops. The intelligence officer stared. That's a 60% hit rate. Our average is 8%. I know. What changed? The pilot hesitated. Torpedoes worked better. That's all I know. But word was spreading. The 5 mechanics who'd done modifications were quietly talking. Not officially, just conversations. Hey, you want your torpedo to actually hit something? Other mechanics started asking questions. Aircraft engineers got involved. By nightfall, 20 men knew something had been done to those torpedoes. Captain of the Enterprise called a meeting. Squadron commanders, engineering officers, intelligence. He wanted answers. We just had the most successful torpedo attack in this ship's history, the captain said. I want to know why. What did we do differently? Silence. Nobody wanted to admit unauthorized modifications. Court-martial was still possible. Probably likely. Finally, Aviation Machinist's mate, Second Class Norton, spoke. Sir, some of us adjusted torpedo depth settings, compensated for Pacific water temperature, made them run shallower so they'd hit at proper depth. The captain stared at him. You modified Ordnance without authorization? Yes, sir. Do you understand that's a court-martial offense? Yes, sir. But our torpedoes were missing. Running too deep. Men were dying. The modification worked. We got 6 hits. The captain looked at his engineering officer. Is this technically sound? The engineering officer looked uncomfortable. Sir, I'd need to review the data. But theoretically, water temperature affects hydrostatic depth calibration. If Pacific water is warmer than specification, then our torpedoes run deep and miss, which explains our 8% hit rate. The captain leaned back. How many torpedoes were modified? 10, sir. Out of 12 dropped today. And hit rate was 60%. The captain was quiet. Everyone waited. Finally, how long does this modification take? Norton glanced at the other mechanics. 8 minutes per torpedo, sir. Do it to every torpedo on this ship. Tonight. I want every Mark 13 in our inventory modified by Yo 600 tomorrow. The captain looked at Norton directly. This conversation never happened. The modifications were always within specifications. Understood? Yes, sir. By midnight, every torpedo on Enterprise was modified. 63 Mark 13s. Depth settings adjusted. 3 feet shallower. Word spread to other carriers. Lexington's mechanics heard. They started modifying their torpedoes. Then Bunker Hill. Then Essex. Within 48 hours, every carrier in Task Force 58 had modified its torpedo inventory. Nobody filed reports. Nobody requested authorization. They just did it. Mechanics teaching mechanics, spreading the solution before the bureaucracy could stop it. Japanese pilots noticed immediately. June 21st attack. American torpedo bombers came in. Japanese fighters shot some down. Anti-aircraft killed others. But the ones that got through were hitting. Every torpedo that dropped was running true. Proper depth, straight lines, devastating impacts. Japanese carrier Zuikaku took 3 torpedo hits in 5 minutes. She sank. Carrier Junyo took 2 hits, crippled, had to be scuttled. The American torpedo bombers had suddenly become deadly. The Japanese couldn't understand why. After-action reports from Japanese survivors mentioned it. American torpedoes now run perfect depth. Their weapons have improved dramatically. Something changed in their ordnance. Japanese naval intelligence tried to figure it out. They recovered an unexploded American torpedo, examined it, found nothing unusual. The torpedoes looked standard, because they were standard, just calibrated differently. A simple adjustment, invisible unless you knew what to look for. By July 1944, American torpedo bomber hit rates had jumped from 8% to 52%. Over half of all torpedoes dropped were hitting targets. Japanese losses in carrier battles increased dramatically. The Battle of the Philippine Sea turned into a catastrophe for Japan. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots were slaughtering Japanese aircraft. American torpedo bombers were sinking Japanese ships. One unauthorized modification, made by one mechanic, Spread through 5 men, then 20, then hundreds. Changed the entire Pacific War. Bureau of Ordnance in Washington eventually noticed. July 18, 1944. A memo arrived at the Pentagon. Field reports indicate dramatic improvement in Mark 13 performance. Request investigation into causes. Navy engineers examined returned torpedoes, found the depth modifications, realized what had happened. Field mechanics had fixed the problem Washington refused to acknowledge. The Navy had 3 options. Court-martial everyone involved, admit the torpedoes were defectively calibrated, or quietly adopt the modification as official procedure. They chose option 3. August 2, 1944. Technical bulletin issued to all Pacific Fleet units. Mark 13 depth settings should be adjusted 2.5 to 3 feet shallow to compensate for Pacific water density. No explanation, no admission of prior error, no acknowledgement of field modifications. Just a bulletin. The mechanics who'd done the original modifications got nothing. No medals, no commendations, no recognition, because recognizing them meant admitting they'd been right and the Navy had been wrong. Hendricks spent July 1944 in a Japanese POW camp. He didn't know his modification had spread, didn't know the impact, didn't know he'd changed the war. He just knew Walsh was dead, and he was alive, and 2 Japanese carriers had sunk. That was enough. August 1945, Philippines. POW. Liberation. American forces freed Hendricks on August 23, 1945. He'd lost 40 pounds. Dysentery. Malaria. Barely alive. They flew him to a hospital in Manila. 3 weeks of recovery. IV fluids. Medicine. Real food. In September, an intelligence officer came to interview him. Standard debriefing. The officer asked about his shoot-down, his capture, his imprisonment. Then the officer asked about June 20, 1944. You were aboard the Avenger that hit Shokaku twice, correct? Yes, Hendricks said. Your pilot also hit Hiyo before being shot down. Correct. Intelligence reports indicate your aircraft's torpedoes ran at optimal depth. Better than standard. Do you know why? Hendricks considered lying, considered claiming ignorance. But the war was over. Walsh was dead. The truth couldn't hurt anyone now. I modified the depth settings. 3 feet shallow. Compensated for Pacific water temperature. The intelligence officer nodded. Made notes. Did you have authorization? No. You modified ordnance without proper authorization. That's a court-martial offense. I know. Hendricks met his eyes. But our torpedoes were missing. Men were dying. I fixed the problem. The intelligence officer kept writing. Your modifications spread through the fleet. By July, most Pacific torpedo bombers were using adjusted depth settings. Hit rates improved from 8% to over 50%. Estimates suggest the modification contributed to sinking or crippling 23 Japanese capital ships. Hendricks said nothing. 23 ships? He'd never imagined it spreading that far. The Navy has decided not to pursue court-martial, the intelligence officer said. Officially, field modifications never happened. Torpedoes were always calibrated correctly. You understand? Yeah, I understand. You'll receive an Air Medal for actions on June 19th and 20th. Officially for manning your gun under fire and assisting in 2 carrier kills. Nothing about modifications. Fine with me. The intelligence officer closed his notebook. Off the record? You saved a lot of lives. Walsh spoke highly of you. Before he died, he told his squadron commander the modification was your idea. That's in his after-action report. The report that officially doesn't exist. Walsh was a good pilot. He sank 2 carriers in 48 hours. That's not just good, that's legendary. September 1945. Hendricks rotated home. Discharged December 2, 1945. Back to Duluth. Back to his father's garage. Rebuilt engines. Fixed transmissions. Never talked about the war. People asked, of course. Veterans always got asked. Hendricks would say he was a mechanic. Maintained torpedo bombers. Flew a few missions. Got shot down. Spent time in a POW camp. Nothing special. He didn't mention modifying torpedoes. Didn't mention Walsh sinking 2 carriers. Didn't mention changing the Pacific War. Those memories were private, personal, not for sharing. In 1947, Hendricks received a letter from Walsh's family. Walsh's mother had learned Hendricks was alive. She wanted to meet the man her son flew with. Hendricks visited Boston in October 1947. Spent 3 days with Walsh's mother and his fiancée, Margaret. They asked about Walsh's last missions. Hendricks told them the truth. All of it. The modification, the hits, the carriers sinking, Walsh dying trying to evade. They deserved to know their son had been a hero. Margaret asked, "Did Tommy know about the modification?" "Yes, he asked me to do it. Said he wanted to make it home to you," she cried. So did Hendricks. They sat in Walsh's mother's kitchen and cried for a pilot who died fighting a burning airplane away from a carrier he'd just torpedoed. Years later, researchers estimated the modification's impact. Between June 1944 and August 1945, American torpedo bombers sank or damaged 87 Japanese ships. Pre-modification, they'd sunk 23 ships in 2 years. The depth adjustment increased effectiveness by over 400%. Lives saved were harder to calculate, but hit rates going from 8% to 52% meant fewer second runs. Fewer second runs meant fewer aircraft shot down. Fewer aircraft lost meant fewer pilots killed. Conservative estimate: 80 to 120 American pilots survived because their torpedoes hit on first runs instead of missing. Those pilots flew more missions, saved more lives, came home to families, had children, built lives, all because one mechanic spent 8 minutes adjusting a depth setting. Walsh's name went on memorials. He received a Navy Cross posthumously. His mother accepted it at a ceremony in 1946. Hendricks attended. He stood in the back, didn't speak, just honored his pilot. Hendricks' name went nowhere, no official recognition. The Navy's records still showed Mark 13 torpedoes performing within specifications. The unofficial modifications were never documented. Hendricks was fine with that. He hadn't done it for medals. He'd done it because Hayes was dead. Because Walsh wanted to marry Margaret. Because 30 men from his squadron had died and the Navy wouldn't fix the problem. That was reason enough. Robert Hendricks died in 1998. Age 78. Heart attack. He'd spent 53 years running his father's garage in Duluth. Fixed cars. Raised 3 kids. Lived quietly. The war was something he'd done when he was young, not something that defined him. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Patricia Morrison was researching Mark 13 torpedo modifications. She found Walsh's after-action report, the one that officially didn't exist, filed in a mislabeled box in the National Archives. The report mentioned Hendricks by name, mentioned the modification, mentioned the results. Morrison tracked down Hendricks' family. His daughter provided letters, photographs, his personal notebook with torpedo failure data, everything Hendricks had kept from the war. Morrison published her findings in 2005. Unauthorized innovation, field modifications of the Mark 13 torpedo in Pacific theater operations, 1944-1945. The paper detailed everything: Hendricks' analysis, the modification procedure, the spread through the fleet, the impact on naval operations. The paper estimated 80 to 100 American pilots survived because of improved torpedo performance. 23 Japanese capital ships sunk or damaged. Strategic impact on the Pacific War, measurable in months of shortened combat operations. All because a 24-year-old mechanic from Duluth refused to watch more men die. Morrison concluded, military innovation rarely emerges from official channels. Development committees move slowly. Bureaucracies resist change. Recognition of defects threatens careers. In contrast, field personnel see problems immediately. They know what's failing. They know what's needed. And sometimes they act without authorization, because lives depend on speed, not process. That's how real innovation happens in war, not through engineering committees in Washington, not through months of testing and evaluation, through mechanics like Hendricks who see problems, find solutions, and implement them in the middle of the night because tomorrow men will die if nothing changes. Walsh got his Navy Cross. His name is on memorials. Schools in Boston teach his story. 2 carriers. 48 hours. Legendary. Hendricks got nothing official, but his daughter keeps his tools in her garage. The same screwdriver he used to adjust that first torpedo's depth setting. She shows it to her grandchildren, tells them their grandfather saved lives, changed history, made the right choice when it mattered. Every torpedo bomber pilot who survived the Pacific War owes something to Robert Hendricks. Most of them never knew his name. That's fine. He didn't need recognition. He needed torpedoes that worked. He needed men to stop dying. He got both. Each of those pilots matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Walsh, Hayes, Kowalski, Chen, Douglas, Miller. The 30 men from Torpedo Squadron 10 who died. The 80 to 100 who lived. All of them, heroes, every single one. If this story moved you, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Share it with someone who appreciates real history. These stories matter. These men matter. Thank you for keeping their memories alive.